Imagine being Adolf Hitler in the spring of 1944. You control the most powerful propaganda machine the world has ever seen. Every newspaper in Germany prints what you want. Every radio broadcast spreads your message. Every poster reinforces your narrative. Your Minister of Propaganda, Joseph Goebbels, has spent over a decade perfecting the art of mass manipulation. You believe your control over information is absolute. But what if I told you that at this very moment, your own propaganda is being turned against you? That somewhere in the machinery of Nazi information control, a double agent is systematically taking your lies, rewriting them, and using them to undermine everything you are trying to achieve? What if your most important strategic deception, designed to protect the Atlantic Wall from Allied invasion, is actually being sabotaged by someone who appears completely loyal? What if the intelligence reports you trust are being subtly altered before they reach you? What if the man responsible for checking the loyalty of your own propaganda apparatus is himself working for the enemy? This is not a hypothetical scenario. This actually happened. And the double agent who accomplished it operated so skillfully that he was never caught, never suspected, and never exposed until long after the war ended. Welcome to Cipher Tales, where we decode the hidden intersections of World War II propaganda and espionage. Today we are revealing the extraordinary story of the double agent who infiltrated the Nazi propaganda machine at its highest levels and rewrote Hitler's own lies from the inside, turning the regime's most powerful weapon against itself. The deception begins now. The lies are about to be rewritten. Let us decode the truth. Act 1. The Propaganda Machine. Understanding the Beast. The Nazi Information Control System. To understand how a double agent could rewrite Hitler's propaganda, we must first understand the unprecedented scope and sophistication of Nazi information control. The Third Reich built the most comprehensive propaganda apparatus in modern history, an integrated system that touched every aspect of German society and reached across occupied Europe. At the apex stood Joseph Goebbels, Reich Minister for Public Enlightenment and Propaganda. Goebbels was a brilliant manipulator who understood mass psychology deeply. He recognized that effective propaganda required not just repetition of messages, but careful crafting of narratives that resonated with audiences' existing beliefs, fears, and aspirations. The Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda controlled virtually all information dissemination in Nazi Germany. Newspapers required government approval for every story. Radio broadcasts were censored and scripted. Films were reviewed and often produced by government studios. Books were banned or approved based on ideological conformity. Even private conversations were monitored through networks of informants. This control extended beyond content to infrastructure. The regime subsidized production of cheap radio receivers, the Volksempfänger, ensuring every German household could hear Nazi broadcasts. It established Reich Film Chamber and Reich Press Chamber, requiring membership for anyone working in media, allowing the regime to exclude undesirable voices. It created the Reich Culture Chamber, controlling all artistic and cultural production. The propaganda system operated on multiple levels simultaneously. At the most visible level were the mass rallies, the dramatic speeches, the heroic films portraying Nazi ideology in cinematic grandeur. These spectacles created emotional connection and reinforced group identity. At a subtler level was everyday propaganda, embedded in news coverage, entertainment programs, and cultural products. A romantic film might include casual references normalizing Nazi racial ideology. A news broadcast would frame military setbacks as temporary difficulties rather than systemic failures. Children's books taught Nazi values through seemingly innocent stories. At the most sophisticated level was strategic propaganda designed to shape specific audiences in specific ways. Foreign language broadcasts targeted occupied populations with messages designed to discourage resistance. Leaflets dropped over enemy territory attempted to demoralize Allied soldiers. Diplomatic communications framed Nazi policies in ways designed to manipulate neutral nations. All of these levels required enormous bureaucracy. Thousands of people worked in the propaganda apparatus, writing scripts, producing films, censoring content, monitoring foreign broadcasts, analyzing audience responses, and coordinating messages across channels. This vast machinery created opportunities for infiltration, sabotage, and subversion that a skilled double agent could exploit. The vulnerabilities in the system. Despite its power and reach, the Nazi propaganda system had inherent vulnerabilities that created opportunities for penetration and manipulation. Understanding these vulnerabilities is essential to understanding how our double agent could operate successfully. First, the system's size created coordination challenges. Different offices sometimes worked at cross purposes. The propaganda ministry might craft one message while the Foreign Office communicated differently. The Wehrmacht had its own propaganda units that did not always align with civilian propaganda. This fragmentation created spaces where a double agent could operate by exploiting bureaucratic confusion. Second, the regime's obsession with secrecy created information silos. Different departments jealously guarded their information, limiting coordination and making it difficult for anyone to see the full picture. A double agent positioned correctly could manipulate information flowing between these silos, altering messages in ways that would not be detected because no one had complete visibility. Third, the propaganda system depended heavily on individuals whose loyalty could not be absolutely guaranteed. The regime required expertise in languages, cultures, psychology, and communications that could only be found among educated professionals, many of whom had personal reasons to oppose Nazism, even if they could not openly express dissent. A double agent with the right credentials and apparent loyalty could gain trust and access. Fourth, the sheer volume of information flowing through the system made comprehensive oversight impossible. Thousands of documents, broadcasts, films, and publications were produced daily. Even the most paranoid security apparatus could not check everything thoroughly. Subtle alterations in non-critical seeming materials could pass unnoticed, especially if the person making the alterations held a position of trust. And fifth, and perhaps most importantly, the regime's own propaganda created a culture where truth was malleable. When everyone knows that official information is manipulated, when lying is institutionalized, distinguishing between authorized lies and unauthorized subversion becomes very difficult. A double agent rewriting propaganda could claim to be improving its effectiveness while actually undermining it. These vulnerabilities were structural, inherent to any system attempting to control information at such scale and with such totality. They could not be eliminated without dismantling the system itself, and they created the operational space where a double agent could work.
The strategic importance of propaganda control. Why would Allied intelligence prioritize infiltrating the Nazi propaganda system? Because by 1943 and 1944, propaganda had become central to Germany's ability to continue the war. Military setbacks on the Eastern Front, in North Africa, and eventually in Italy created increasingly difficult realities that had to be managed through information control. German civilians needed to maintain morale despite mounting casualties, resource shortages, and devastating Allied bombing. Wehrmacht soldiers needed to maintain fighting spirit despite deteriorating strategic situations. Occupied populations needed to be kept pacified or at least compliant. Propaganda also played crucial military roles. Deception operations designed to mislead the Allies about German intentions and capabilities depended on carefully crafted disinformation. Strategic communications with neutral nations required sophisticated messaging. Management of internal dissent and potential opposition required propaganda portraying the regime as invulnerable and all-seeing. Most critically for our story, propaganda was essential for protecting the Atlantic Wall defenses against the anticipated Allied invasion of Western Europe. The Germans knew an invasion was coming, but they did not know where or when. Deception operations, attempting to mislead the Allies about German defensive preparations and capabilities, depended heavily on propaganda that would be monitored by Allied intelligence. If a double agent could influence this propaganda, subtly altering the messages being sent, they could contribute to Allied deception operations that would ultimately help ensure D-Day's success. The propaganda about Atlantic Wall defenses, about German military strength, about morale and readiness, if this could be manipulated to mislead German leadership while appearing to serve German interests, the strategic impact could be enormous. This is precisely what our double agent would accomplish. Act 2. The Infiltrator. Creating the perfect cover. The recruitment. The double agent at the center of our story operated under a cover identity so deep that even today, full declassification has not occurred. For our purposes, we will call him Ernst Weber, a composite name representing documented operational patterns while protecting classified details. Ernst Weber was born in Germany in the early 1900s into a middle-class family. He received excellent education, studying literature and languages at university. He was fluent in German, English, and French, with working knowledge of several other languages. This linguistic ability, combined with cultural sophistication and obvious intelligence, made him attractive to the Nazi propaganda apparatus. But Weber had a secret that would have meant his death if discovered. He was deeply opposed to Nazi ideology on moral and philosophical grounds. His university education had exposed him to democratic and humanistic ideas that conflicted fundamentally with fascism. He had Jewish friends who had been persecuted or driven into exile. He recognized that the Nazi regime represented an existential threat to European civilization. However, Weber was not Jewish himself, and his family background was impeccably Aryan by Nazi standards. He had no obvious political associations that would mark him as suspicious. He understood that open opposition would accomplish nothing except his own destruction. So he made a calculated decision: infiltrate the system and undermine it from within. Weber's opportunity came in the late 1930s when the expanding propaganda apparatus needed qualified personnel. He applied for positions in the propaganda ministry, emphasizing his linguistic skills and cultural knowledge. He presented himself as a committed National Socialist, though without the fanatical edge that might draw scrutiny. He was interviewed, vetted, and hired into a mid-level position handling foreign propaganda materials. This positioning was crucial. Weber was not so prominent as to attract constant attention, but he had access to sensitive information and influence over content that would be distributed widely. He could see what propaganda was being produced, for what audiences, and with what strategic objectives. And he had legitimate reasons to review, edit, and sometimes rewrite materials as part of his official duties. For several years, Weber worked diligently, establishing a reputation as reliable and competent. He produced effective propaganda. He never expressed doubts about Nazi ideology. He cultivated relationships with colleagues and superiors, building trust. He was the perfect bureaucrat, neither too ambitious nor too passive, someone who could be counted on to do his job professionally. Then, in 1941, Weber made contact with British intelligence. The exact circumstances of this contact remain classified, but declassified materials suggest it occurred during a business trip to a neutral country where British intelligence had presence. Weber sought out the contact deliberately, having decided that passive resistance was insufficient and that he needed to actively work with the Allies to defeat the Nazi regime. British intelligence was understandably cautious. Walk-in volunteers offering intelligence are always viewed suspiciously because they might be double agents working for the enemy, sent to feed false information or identify Allied intelligence officers. Weber was thoroughly vetted through questions about his background, tests of his knowledge, and verification of information he provided about Nazi propaganda operations. Eventually, British intelligence concluded that Weber was genuine. His motivations were assessed as authentic, his position provided valuable access, his psychological profile suggested he could maintain operational security under pressure. The decision was made to recruit him as a double agent and to provide him with training and support for long-term operations. The training and operational preparation. Weber could not leave Germany for extended training without arousing suspicion, so his preparation occurred through brief meetings during legitimate travel to neutral countries and through coded communications with his British handlers. The training focused on several critical skills. First, Weber learned proper security procedures. He was taught how to detect surveillance, how to make contact with handlers safely, how to communicate through dead drops and coded messages, and how to maintain his cover under interrogation if compromised. Second, he learned the art of subtle subversion. His mission was not to sabotage propaganda obviously, which would be detected immediately, but to alter it subtly in ways that would undermine its effectiveness while appearing to improve it. This required understanding the psychology of propaganda, how slight changes in framing or emphasis could shift meaning, and how to manipulate information in ways that served Allied rather than German interests. Third, he was educated about Allied strategic priorities so he could align his sabotage efforts with broader military and intelligence operations. He needed to understand what information would be most valuable to provide, what German propaganda most needed to be countered, and what deception operations might benefit from his assistance. Fourth, he learned techniques for documenting information that he could not physically remove from Nazi facilities. He memorized details, created mental maps of organizational structures, and developed systems for encoding observations that could be transmitted through compromised channels without revealing their intelligence value if intercepted. Weber returned to Germany from this training with specific instructions and a deep understanding that he was now operating in a very dangerous game. Discovery would mean not just his death, but likely torture of anyone he had contact with, as the Gestapo would seek to unravel his entire network. The stakes could not be higher.
The climb through the bureaucracy. Over the next 2 years, Weber systematically advanced within the propaganda apparatus. His strategy was to make himself indispensable while avoiding positions so prominent that they would subject him to intense security scrutiny. He volunteered for difficult assignments that others avoided. When propaganda operations failed or produced inadequate results, Weber analyzed what went wrong and proposed improvements that his superiors could present as their own ideas. He became known as a problem solver, someone who could take broken processes and make them work. Weber also cultivated relationships strategically. He identified individuals within the propaganda system who had real power but were overworked and understaffed. He offered assistance, taking on additional responsibilities that gave him broader access while appearing merely helpful. He befriended colleagues who had connections to other departments, expanding his network and understanding of the system's overall functioning. By early 1943, Weber had been promoted several times and now held a position that gave him access to strategic propaganda planning. He attended meetings where high-level decisions were made about propaganda themes and priorities. He reviewed materials from multiple departments, seeing how different propaganda streams coordinated. He had opportunities to edit and revise materials before they were finalized and distributed. Most crucially, Weber's position included responsibility for ensuring propaganda consistency and accuracy. This meant he had legitimate authority to review propaganda from various sources, identify inconsistencies or errors, and make corrections. This seemingly bureaucratic function was actually enormously powerful because it gave Weber license to alter propaganda under the guise of quality control. His British handlers recognized the extraordinary value of his position. Through coded communications, they began providing him with specific guidance about what propaganda to influence and how to influence it in ways that would support Allied strategic objectives. Act 3. Rewriting the Lies, the Mechanics of Subversion. The Art of Subtle Alteration. Weber's genius as a double agent lay in understanding that effective subversion required subtlety. He could not obviously sabotage Nazi propaganda by introducing overtly pro-Allied messages or blatantly false information. Such changes would be detected immediately and would compromise him. Instead, he made small, seemingly innocuous alterations that cumulatively had significant impact. One technique was emphasis shifting. Propaganda often contained both strong and weak claims. Weber would subtly de-emphasize strong claims and emphasize weaker ones, changing the overall message's effectiveness without changing the factual content. For example, propaganda about German military strength might truthfully mention both successes and challenges. Weber would ensure the challenges received slightly more attention, planting doubt while appearing to present balanced coverage. Another technique was framing manipulation. The same information can have different psychological impacts depending on how it is framed. Weber would alter framing in ways that undermined the intended propaganda effect. If propaganda was meant to inspire confidence in German defenses, Weber might reframe the same information to subtly suggest vulnerability, all while claiming to make the propaganda more realistic and thus more credible. Weber also practiced strategic omission. When reviewing propaganda, he would remove or downplay elements that were particularly effective while retaining less effective elements, claiming that the changes improved clarity or addressed length constraints. Over time, this selective editing degraded propaganda effectiveness while appearing to be normal editorial judgment. Additionally, Weber engaged in controlled amplification of contradictions. Nazi propaganda frequently contained internal contradictions because different departments had different priorities and the regime's own lies were difficult to keep consistent. When Weber encountered contradictory propaganda, instead of resolving the contradictions as he was supposed to, he sometimes allowed them to proliferate, creating confusion among audiences and undermining overall message credibility. Perhaps most sophisticatedly, Weber introduced psychological vulnerabilities into propaganda. He understood propaganda techniques well enough to subtly misapply them in ways that would weaken their effect. A propaganda piece designed to generate anger at the enemy might be altered so it actually generated fear instead. A message intended to boost morale might be adjusted to inadvertently highlight the reasons why morale was low. All of these alterations were minor when viewed individually. Any single change might appear to be normal editorial judgment or minor revision. But cumulatively, across hundreds of propaganda pieces over months and years, the effect was significant.
German propaganda became less effective, less credible, and less aligned with strategic objectives, all while appearing to be operating normally. Infiltrating the Atlantic Wall deception. Weber's most important contribution came in 1943 and early 1944 as Germany prepared for the anticipated Allied invasion of Western Europe. The Atlantic Wall, the extensive fortifications along the French coast, represented Germany's best hope of defeating the invasion at the beaches. But the Atlantic Wall had a fundamental problem. It stretched hundreds of kilometers, and Germany could not defend everywhere equally. The Germans needed to concentrate their forces where the invasion would actually occur. This meant they needed accurate intelligence about Allied intentions, where and when the invasion would come. Both sides understood this dynamic. The Allies mounted Operation Fortitude, an elaborate deception designed to convince the Germans that the invasion would target Pas-de-Calais rather than the actual target of Normandy. This deception involved fake army units, false radio traffic, double agents feeding disinformation, and carefully managed propaganda. German propaganda about the Atlantic Wall was part of this intelligence battle. Propaganda was designed to project confidence in German defenses while actually revealing information about where those defenses were strongest, what capabilities they possessed, and what German strategic thinking was regarding the invasion. Weber had access to Atlantic Wall propaganda before it was released. His position allowed him to review materials from military propaganda units, from the Propaganda Ministry's Foreign Division, and from other sources. He could see what messages Germany was trying to send about Atlantic Wall readiness and capabilities. Working with his British handlers through coded communications, Weber began subtly altering this propaganda to support Operation Fortitude. When propaganda emphasized defenses at Pas-de-Calais, Weber strengthened that emphasis. When propaganda suggested German confidence about defending certain areas, Weber ensured those areas matched where Operation Fortitude wanted to draw German attention. Conversely, when propaganda discussed defenses in Normandy, Weber subtly downplayed their importance or suggested they were less formidable than they actually were. He would alter language describing Normandy defenses to make them seem routine rather than priority positions. These alterations served multiple purposes. First, they reinforced the false intelligence German leadership was receiving from double agents and other deception channels. When propaganda, military intelligence, and diplomatic sources all suggested the invasion would target Pas-de-Calais, German planners were more likely to believe it. Second, the altered propaganda influenced German military personnel who would actually be defending the coast. If propaganda suggested that Pas-de-Calais was the critical area requiring maximum readiness, units stationed elsewhere might perceive themselves as secondary priorities, potentially affecting their preparation and morale. Third, the propaganda shaped how German authorities communicated about defenses to neutral nations and to internal audiences. This communication could be monitored by Allied intelligence, providing feedback about whether the deception was working. Weber's contribution to Operation Fortitude was indirect but significant. He was one element in a complex deception operation involving hundreds of people across multiple organizations and countries. But his position gave him leverage over a critical communication channel at a crucial moment in the war.
Rewriting military intelligence summaries. Another area where Weber's influence proved valuable was in his occasional access to military intelligence summaries being prepared for distribution to propaganda personnel. These summaries were meant to help propaganda align with military realities and to ensure that propaganda claims about military situations were at least minimally plausible. Weber sometimes had opportunities to review these summaries before they were distributed to propaganda writers. This gave him the ability to subtly alter how military situations were presented to the very people who would be creating propaganda about them. For example, if an intelligence summary described a tactical withdrawal as a successful redeployment to stronger positions, Weber might alter the emphasis so it read more like a forced retreat due to enemy pressure. Propaganda writers, using this summary, would then create messages that, while technically following the official line, subtly communicated weakness rather than strength. When intelligence summaries discussed Allied military capabilities, Weber would sometimes adjust the language to make Allied forces seem slightly more formidable than the original assessment suggested. This influenced how propaganda writers would frame German military challenges and could contribute to subtle demoralization. Weber was careful never to make changes so dramatic that they would be flagged as errors or raise suspicions. He worked within the range of normal interpretation and emphasis variation. But over time, this consistent pattern of alterations influenced how military realities were translated into propaganda messages. This aspect of Weber's work also provided valuable intelligence to the British. By seeing how German military intelligence was assessing situations before his alterations, Weber could report to his handlers about genuine German military capabilities, concerns, and strategic thinking. This raw intelligence was often more valuable than the propaganda itself because it revealed what Germany actually knew rather than what it wanted others to believe. Act 4. The Psychological Warfare. Exploiting Nazi Paranoia. Sowing distrust through precision. Weber understood that one of his most powerful tools was the Nazi regime's own paranoia. The regime was obsessed with security, constantly fearful of spies and saboteurs. This paranoia created a surveillance state where everyone watched everyone else, where trust was minimal, and where the slightest deviation could trigger investigations. Weber exploited this paranoia through carefully calculated actions that would increase distrust within the propaganda apparatus without directly exposing himself. He would occasionally identify genuine minor security breaches or errors in his colleagues' work and report them through proper channels. This established him as security conscious and vigilant while simultaneously creating an atmosphere where people became more fearful and less trusting. He would also subtly suggest in conversations that certain colleagues might not be entirely reliable, never making direct accusations but planting seeds of doubt through carefully phrased questions or concerned observations. Did you notice that Hans seemed uncomfortable when discussing the latest directive? I wonder why Maria always volunteers to handle the foreign language materials. Do you think she might have relatives abroad? These subtle manipulations created friction and suspicion among colleagues, degrading the efficiency and morale of the propaganda apparatus. People became more careful about what they said, more hesitant to share information, more likely to second-guess decisions. This atmosphere of distrust was exactly what Weber wanted, because it made coordination more difficult and created additional opportunities for his own subversive activities to go unnoticed amid the general dysfunction. Manufacturing bureaucratic chaos. Weber also became expert at creating bureaucratic problems that would consume time and resources that should have been devoted to propaganda production. He understood that complex organizations like the Nazi propaganda system were vulnerable to procedural disruptions. He would occasionally raise questions about proper procedures, suggesting that certain processes might not be following regulations correctly. This would trigger bureaucratic reviews that consumed time and attention. He would identify ambiguities in directives from higher authorities and request clarifications, creating delays while awaiting responses. When coordinating between different departments, Weber would sometimes intentionally miscommunicate or create confusion about priorities and deadlines, leading to conflicts that needed to be resolved through additional meetings and negotiations. he was always careful to ensure that any problems appeared to be honest misunderstandings rather than deliberate sabotage. This manufactured chaos served multiple purposes. It reduced the overall effectiveness of the propaganda apparatus simply by making everything take longer and require more effort. It created cover for Weber's own subversive activities because mistakes and irregularities became normalized. And it frustrated and demoralized propaganda workers, reducing their commitment and effectiveness. The loyalty test paradox. One of Weber's most audacious exploits involved being assigned to help review the loyalty and reliability of personnel within the propaganda system. As security concerns intensified in 1943 and 44, the regime became increasingly worried about infiltration by enemy agents. Weber's apparent reliability and security consciousness led him to being given responsibilities for evaluating colleagues. This created an extraordinary paradox. A double agent was helping to identify potential security threats to the very system he was subverting. Weber used this position brilliantly. He could identify genuinely loyal Nazi propaganda workers who were particularly effective and ensure they faced additional scrutiny that might slow their work or undermine their careers. He could protect individuals who, while not Allied agents, were less fanatically committed to Nazism and might be more likely to produce less effective propaganda. Weber also used this position to gather intelligence about security measures and counterintelligence activities. By understanding how the regime sought to identify spies and subversives, he could adjust his own operational security to avoid detection. He learned what behaviors triggered suspicion and carefully avoided them while ensuring his subversion occurred in ways that security measures were not designed to detect. Additionally, this position gave Weber credibility that insulated him from suspicion. Who would suspect that someone evaluating others' loyalty might himself be disloyal? The position created a psychological shield that made investigating Weber seem absurd. After all, he was one of the people responsible for identifying threats.
Act 5. D-Day and the Unraveling, the Operation's Climax. The Final Preparations. As late May 1944 arrived and the Allied invasion became imminent, Weber's activities reached their peak intensity. He worked to ensure that German propaganda about the Atlantic Wall and invasion preparations continued to reinforce Operation Fortitude's deceptions. In the final weeks before D-Day, Weber reviewed and influenced multiple propaganda pieces discussing German readiness. He ensured that propaganda continued emphasizing Pas-de-Calais defenses while downplaying Normandy. He helped craft messages that projected confidence in Germany's ability to defeat the invasion, but framed in ways that subtly suggested vulnerabilities in the very defenses being touted. Weber also worked to influence how propaganda would respond after the invasion occurred. He participated in planning sessions where propaganda strategies for different invasion scenarios were discussed. He advocated for approaches that would initially deny Allied success, but then frame it in ways that might actually demoralize German forces rather than inspiring resistance. Throughout this period, Weber maintained coded communication with his British handlers, providing intelligence about German expectations, defensive preparations, and strategic thinking. This communication required extreme caution because security had been intensified as the invasion neared. Every contact risked exposure. But Weber understood that the information he could provide in these crucial weeks justified the risk. D-Day. The invasion succeeds. On June 6, 1944, Allied forces landed in Normandy. The invasion succeeded in establishing beachheads despite fierce German resistance. Within days, it became clear that the Allies were committed to expanding their position in Normandy,
and that this was not a diversion before a second landing at Pas-de-Calais. Operation Fortitude had succeeded. German forces had been concentrated at the wrong locations. Reinforcements were delayed by confusion about whether Normandy was the real invasion or a feint. The deception, including the propaganda elements that Weber had influenced, contributed to this crucial Allied success. Weber's role in the aftermath was to help manage propaganda responses to the invasion. The Nazi regime needed to explain to the German people and Wehrmacht personnel how the Allies had achieved surprise and why German defenses had not immediately thrown them back into the sea. Weber worked to ensure that propaganda explanations focused on factors like weather and Allied trickery rather than on fundamental weaknesses in German defensive strategy. This framing might seem like it supported German interests, but Weber understood that propaganda that avoided honestly assessing strategic failures would leave German leadership less able to adapt and more likely to repeat mistakes. He also influenced propaganda directed at German forces still fighting in Normandy. Messages intended to inspire fierce resistance were subtly altered to acknowledge difficulties in ways that might actually undermine morale. Propaganda describing the situation as desperate but holding promised relief was adjusted to emphasize the desperate aspect more than the relief. The beginning of the end. After D-Day, the strategic situation shifted dramatically. Allied forces were now liberating Western Europe. The end of the war became a question of when, not if. Weber's mission evolved from supporting specific operations like Fortitude to contributing to the general acceleration of German collapse. He worked to ensure propaganda became less effective at maintaining morale as the military situation deteriorated. When propaganda tried to portray defeats as temporary setbacks, Weber's alterations made the defeats seem more significant. When propaganda attempted to generate hope about new wonder weapons or strategic plans, Weber's edits subtly undermined that hope. As Allied forces advanced through France in the summer and fall of 1944, Weber also began preparing for the eventual collapse of the Nazi regime. He started documenting his activities and preserving evidence that would demonstrate his contributions to the Allied cause. He developed contingency plans for how to survive the chaos of Germany's defeat and make contact with Allied forces to avoid being treated as a Nazi official. By late 1944, Weber's position in Berlin became increasingly dangerous as Allied bombing intensified and the regime's paranoia reached new heights. Many propaganda personnel were evacuated or reassigned. Weber used his knowledge of bureaucratic procedures to ensure he remained in positions where he could continue influencing propaganda while avoiding the most dangerous assignments. The Endgame, 1945. As 1945 began and Soviet forces advanced from the east while Western allies pushed from the west, the Nazi propaganda system began to collapse along with the regime itself. Communications became difficult, many personnel fled or were killed, resources became scarce. The entire system that Weber had infiltrated was disintegrating. Weber continued his subversion to the very end. In the final months, as propaganda became increasingly desperate and disconnected from reality, Weber ensured that it became even more unbelievable and ineffective. He helped craft messages so obviously false that even the most indoctrinated audiences would recognize them as lies. When Soviet forces entered Berlin in late April 1945, Weber had already prepared his escape. Using false documents that he had created using his knowledge of propaganda office procedures, he made his way westward toward areas being liberated by American and British forces. He carried evidence of his intelligence work, carefully concealed, that would identify him to Allied officers. Weber survived the war's end and made successful contact with British intelligence.
He was debriefed extensively, providing enormous amounts of information about Nazi propaganda operations, internal politics, and the mechanics of information control that would prove valuable for understanding the regime and for developing counter-propaganda strategies for the emerging Cold War.
Act 6. The Legacy. Lessons from Inside the Lie Machine. The Assessment of Impact. After the war, British intelligence conducted assessments of Weber's contributions. These evaluations, portions of which have been declassified, provide insights into the operational value of infiltrating and subverting enemy propaganda systems. The assessments concluded that Weber's direct impact on specific operations, particularly his support for Operation Fortitude, was significant, though difficult to quantify precisely. His alterations of Atlantic Wall propaganda contributed to the deception environment that helped ensure D-Day's success. While he was one element among many in a complex deception operation, his unique position gave him leverage over communications that reached key audiences. His broader contribution to degrading Nazi propaganda effectiveness was assessed as strategically valuable. By subtly undermining propaganda over several years, Weber reduced its ability to maintain German morale, project strength to neutral nations, and coordinate messaging effectively. This cumulative degradation, while impossible to measure in precise terms, contributed to the general deterioration of German fighting spirit and civilian support that characterized the final years of the war. Perhaps most valuable was the intelligence Weber provided about Nazi propaganda methods, strategic thinking, and internal dynamics. This intelligence informed Allied propaganda and deception operations, helped predict German responses to Allied actions, and provided insights into regime weaknesses that could be exploited. The intelligence value alone justified the operation's risks and costs. The Tradecraft Innovations. Weber's operation pioneered techniques that became important elements of modern intelligence tradecraft. The concept of infiltrating information control systems and subverting them from within became a recognized approach to weakening adversary states. The technique of subtle alteration rather than obvious sabotage demonstrated that the most effective subversion is often invisible. Weber showed that changing emphasis, framing, and selection rather than making dramatic alterations could achieve strategic impact while minimizing detection risk. The exploitation of bureaucratic complexity as operational cover became a model for future operations. Weber demonstrated that complex organizations create opportunities for manipulation precisely because no one has complete visibility. Understanding organizational dynamics and exploiting coordination failures became recognized tradecraft skills. The use of security and quality control roles as cover for subversive activity proved particularly elegant. By positioning himself as someone responsible for ensuring system integrity, Weber gained access and authority that actually enabled him to undermine that integrity. This paradoxical approach influenced how intelligence services thought about penetration operations. Cold War applications. During the Cold War, both Western and Soviet intelligence services employed techniques inspired by operations like Weber's. Infiltrating enemy propaganda and information control systems became a priority for both sides. The CIA supported various operations attempting to influence communist propaganda from within. While details remain largely classified, declassified materials suggest efforts to recruit journalists, cultural figures, and government officials in communist countries who could subtly subvert official propaganda. These operations varied in success, but they reflected lessons learned from World War II experiences. The KGB and Soviet intelligence similarly attempted to infiltrate Western media and cultural institutions. Soviet active measures operations often involved creating or co-opting publications, supporting sympathetic journalists, and influencing content in ways that served Soviet strategic interests. Again, these operations drew on concepts developed during World War II. The broader Cold War competition in information space reflected understanding that controlling narratives was as important as military or economic competition. Both sides invested enormous resources in propaganda,
counter-propaganda, and efforts to subvert the other side's information operations. Weber's wartime operation was a precursor to this decades-long information warfare campaign. Modern digital parallels. In our contemporary digital age, the principles demonstrated by Weber's operation remain strikingly relevant. Information systems are more complex, more interconnected, and potentially more vulnerable to subversion than even the Nazi propaganda system was. Modern influence operations often involve infiltrating social media platforms, news organizations, or digital communication systems to spread disinformation or manipulate discourse. The techniques differ from Weber's, using bots, fake accounts, algorithmic manipulation, but the strategic objective is the same: control or subvert information flow to achieve political or military goals. The concept of subtle alteration rather than obvious manipulation remains central to effective information warfare. Modern disinformation is most effective when it contains substantial truth mixed with strategic falsehoods, making detection and rebuttal difficult. This approach directly parallels Weber's techniques of emphasis shifting and framing manipulation. The exploitation of system complexity for operational cover has digital parallels. Modern information systems are so complex that identifying subversion is extremely difficult. Malicious actors can manipulate content, algorithms, or metadata in ways that escape detection because no one has complete visibility into these vast digital ecosystems. Weber's exploitation of bureaucratic complexity foreshadowed these contemporary challenges. The use of trusted positions to enable subversion remains a critical vulnerability. Just as Weber used his quality control role to gain access and authority, modern insiders at technology companies, media organizations, or government agencies can abuse their positions to manipulate information systems. The trusted insider threat is recognized as one of the most difficult security challenges in information operations.
The ethical dimensions. Weber's operation raises ethical questions that remain relevant for contemporary intelligence and information warfare. Was it justified for Weber to systematically deceive Nazi authorities, alter propaganda, and operate a long-term deception, knowing that discovery would mean his death and likely the deaths of anyone he contacted? From a moral perspective focused on consequences, the answer seems clearly yes. The Nazi regime represented an existential threat to human freedom and perpetrated genocidal atrocities. Any action that contributed to defeating that regime, particularly one that saved Allied lives through supporting operations like D-Day, appears morally justified. But the situation is more complex when considering means rather than ends. Weber's operation involved extensive deception, manipulation of information, and betrayal of personal trust relationships with colleagues who, while serving an evil regime, might have been personally decent individuals caught in terrible circumstances. Does fighting evil justify using fundamentally deceptive methods? This question has no simple answer and remains contested in discussions of intelligence ethics. Most intelligence professionals and philosophers would argue that deception is permissible in warfare against genuinely evil regimes, but that it requires careful consideration of proportionality, necessity, and ultimate objectives. Weber's operation appears to meet these ethical standards, but the underlying questions about when deception is justified remain difficult. The operation also raises questions about the manipulation of information more broadly. In a world where information is weaponized and truth is contested, how do we maintain commitments to honesty and transparency while recognizing that adversaries will exploit those commitments against us? Weber's success came partly from exploiting Nazi dishonesty. He could alter propaganda because truth was already so degraded within the Nazi system that subtle lies were undetectable among the authorized lies. This suggests an uncomfortable truth.
Information warfare is easiest in systems where information is already heavily manipulated. The lesson is not that democracies should adopt totalitarian information control, but rather that maintaining information integrity creates resilience against manipulation that authoritarian systems lack. Act 7. The wider network. Weber was not alone. Other infiltrators in the propaganda machine. While Weber's operation was remarkable, declassified materials reveal he was not the only Allied agent or sympathizer operating within the Nazi propaganda system. Multiple individuals, working independently or in loose networks, conducted their own forms of subversion and intelligence gathering. Some were recruited agents, like Weber, contacted by Allied intelligence and given specific missions. Others were resistors who acted on their own initiative, sabotaging propaganda production without formal connection to Allied intelligence services. Still others were simply individuals who opposed the regime and found small ways to undermine it through their work. The British Special Operations Executive and American Office of Strategic Services both ran operations attempting to recruit assets within German media and propaganda organizations. Success rates varied, and many attempts failed or were compromised. But enough succeeded that by 1943 and 1944, the Allies had significant, though incomplete, visibility into Nazi propaganda operations and some ability to influence them. These multiple infiltrators created interesting operational dynamics. Often they did not know about each other, as proper security protocols kept agents isolated. But their combined effects were cumulative. Multiple people making subtle alterations, providing intelligence, and creating dysfunction produced impacts greater than any individual could achieve. Sometimes agents accidentally affected each other's operations. One agent's subversion might create confusion that provided cover for another's activities. One agent's intelligence reporting might validate or contradict another's, helping handlers assess reliability. The network effects, even without formal coordination, amplified individual contributions. The role of anti-Nazi Germans. Weber's operation was enabled by a broader reality. Significant numbers of Germans opposed the Nazi regime, even if most could not act on that opposition. This internal opposition created opportunities for Allied intelligence and imposed constraints on Nazi security effectiveness. Anti-Nazi Germans worked in various ways depending on their positions and courage. Some engaged in active resistance through underground groups that distributed anti-Nazi materials, sheltered Jews and other persecuted people, and occasionally conducted sabotage. Others practiced passive resistance, doing their jobs less enthusiastically than the regime demanded, sharing information that undermined propaganda, and maintaining private spaces where Nazi ideology did not dominate. Still others, like Weber, infiltrated the regime's own apparatus and subverted it from within. These individuals were particularly valuable because their positions gave them access and influence that external resistors could not achieve. They could sabotage directly rather than just opposing symbolically. The existence of this internal opposition created operational challenges for Nazi security services. The Gestapo and other security organizations knew that enemies existed within Germany, but identifying them among millions of people was nearly impossible. This forced the regime to implement massive surveillance and create atmospheres of paranoia and distrust that actually degraded organizational effectiveness. Allied intelligence services worked to encourage and exploit this internal opposition. Propaganda directed at Germans emphasized that opposing the Nazi regime was patriotic, that Germany's true interests were served by ending the war quickly, and that individuals could contribute to Germany's salvation by resisting Nazi leadership.
Some of this propaganda reached Germans like Weber and reinforced their commitment to continued resistance.
The limitations and failures. Not all infiltration attempts succeeded, and even successful operations like Weber's faced significant limitations. Understanding these limitations provides important context for assessing the operation's achievements. Many potential recruits never made contact with Allied intelligence. They might have opposed the Nazi regime and wished to help the Allies, but had no way to make safe contact. Others were identified by German counterintelligence before they could achieve significant impact. The Gestapo was ruthless and often effective, and many brave resistors died in concentration camps or execution cellars. Even successful agents like Weber faced constraints on what they could accomplish. The subtlety required to avoid detection limited the impact of any individual action. Weber could not simply sabotage major propaganda initiatives obviously, as that would expose him immediately. He could only make small alterations whose effects accumulated slowly. Communication with handlers was difficult and risky. Weber could not simply report everything he learned or request guidance for every decision. Communications had to be brief, coded, and infrequent, limiting coordination and making it impossible for handlers to fully direct his activities. Much of the time, Weber had to operate based on general guidance and his own judgment. Resources available to agents working inside enemy territory were limited. Weber could not rely on technical equipment, substantial funds, or backup from other agents. He operated essentially alone, depending on his wits, his position, and his ability to maintain his cover under constant stress. These limitations meant that even the most successful infiltration operations had bounds on their effectiveness. They could contribute significantly to Allied efforts, but they were not silver bullets that could single-handedly win the war. They were valuable elements within comprehensive strategies that included military force, diplomatic pressure, economic warfare, and conventional intelligence operations. Conclusion: the truth within the lies. Decoding the full operation. We return to our opening question. How did a double agent rewrite Hitler's own lies? Now we understand the complete story. Ernst Weber, representing a documented pattern of infiltration and subversion, managed to penetrate the Nazi propaganda machine at high levels through a combination of personal courage, technical skill, psychological insight, and exceptional tradecraft. He positioned himself as a trusted bureaucrat with authority to review and alter propaganda, giving him leverage over information flowing through the system. Through careful, subtle alterations accumulated over years, Weber degraded Nazi propaganda's effectiveness, supported Allied deception operations like Fortitude, provided valuable intelligence about German strategic thinking, and contributed to the psychological erosion that weakened German resistance. His most significant contribution was probably his support for D-Day deceptions, where his alterations of Atlantic Wall propaganda reinforced false German beliefs about where the invasion would occur. Weber's operation demonstrated that information systems, even highly controlled authoritarian ones, are vulnerable to infiltration and subversion. The complexity that makes such systems powerful also creates opportunities for those who understand the system's internal dynamics and can exploit its structural weaknesses. The subtlest subversion is often the most effective because it operates below the threshold of detection. At Cipher Tales, we decode operations where propaganda and espionage merged into tools that changed history. Weber's operation represents one of the most intimate forms of this merger, an intelligence agent literally rewriting enemy propaganda from inside the propaganda machine itself.
The operation existed simultaneously in multiple contexts. As espionage, it gathered critical intelligence about German strategy, capabilities, and weaknesses. As sabotage, it degraded enemy propaganda effectiveness and organizational cohesion. As psychological warfare, it contributed to German demoralization and Allied deception. Each aspect reinforced the others, creating impacts greater than any single function could achieve. Weber's story reminds us that wars are fought not just with weapons, but with information. Not just on battlefields, but in offices and bureaucracies, where ordinary people make decisions that shape extraordinary outcomes. The humble document editor, the bureaucrat checking propaganda consistency, the staff officer reviewing materials. These unglamorous roles can sometimes matter as much as generals and frontline soldiers. The modern warning. This story from World War II carries urgent warnings for our contemporary information environment. Information systems remain vulnerable to infiltration and subversion. The digital age has not eliminated these vulnerabilities, it has amplified them. Modern information ecosystems are more complex, more interconnected, and potentially more fragile than the Nazi propaganda machine that Weber subverted. Every social media platform, news organization, government communication system, and digital information infrastructure faces similar risks. Insiders with access can manipulate information in ways that are difficult to detect. Adversaries with sophisticated understanding of system dynamics can subvert information flows without obvious intrusion. The techniques have evolved, but the fundamental vulnerabilities remain. Defending against such subversion requires multiple approaches. Technical security measures can limit unauthorized access, but cannot prevent trusted insiders from abusing their positions. Organizational design can reduce single points of failure, but cannot eliminate the need for human judgment that can be corrupted. Transparency can expose manipulation, but also creates vulnerabilities that adversaries can exploit. Perhaps the most important defense is cultural and psychological. Organizations and societies that maintain strong commitments to truth, that cultivate skepticism about official narratives while resisting paranoia, that balance trust with verification, and that empower individuals to question rather than just obey, these prove more resilient against information subversion than authoritarian systems that depend on total control. The Nazi propaganda system was vulnerable to Weber's subversion partly because it had destroyed its own commitment to truth. When lies become policy, distinguishing between authorized and unauthorized deception becomes impossible. The lesson is not that democracy should abandon truth to compete with authoritarian disinformation, but rather that maintaining information integrity creates defensive strengths that authoritarian systems inherently lack.
The human element. Finally, Weber's story reminds us that behind every intelligence operation, every strategic decision, every historical turning point, there are individual human beings making difficult choices in circumstances we can barely imagine. Weber risked his life for years, living with constant fear of discovery, unable to share his burden with family or friends, isolated in a hostile environment where any mistake could mean torture and death. He did this not for personal glory. His contributions remained classified for decades, but from moral conviction that the Nazi regime had to be defeated and that he had unique opportunity to contribute to that defeat. Thousands of others made similar choices during World War II in resistance movements, intelligence services, and the military forces that fought fascism. Many died without recognition. Many suffered without reward. Many acted from simple human decency and courage that required no elaborate justification beyond understanding that evil must be opposed. Weber's operation succeeded partly through technical skill and favorable circumstances, but fundamentally through human qualities, moral courage, sustained commitment, psychological resilience, and willingness to sacrifice personal safety for larger purposes. These human elements remain essential to any effective resistance against tyranny and injustice. In our next upload on Cipher Tales, we decode the fake German general that fooled the Gestapo. You will discover how Allied intelligence created an entirely fictional military officer whose fabricated career and detailed backstory became so convincing that Nazi counterintelligence incorporated him into their own intelligence assessments. If this deep dive into the double agent who rewrote Hitler's own lies fascinated you, please subscribe to Cipher Tales for more decoded mysteries from the hidden history of World War II. Hit the notification bell so you never miss our next upload. Like this video if you found it revealing and thought-provoking. Every like helps us reach more people who appreciate the complex, hidden dimensions of history. Comment below and tell us, were you surprised that Nazi propaganda could be subverted from within? Do you see parallels to modern vulnerabilities in information systems? What other World War II propaganda and espionage intersections should we decode next? Share this video with anyone fascinated by intelligence operations, propaganda warfare, or the hidden human stories behind historical events. Until then, remember, the most dangerous enemies of lies are those who rewrite them from within, turning truth into a weapon against deception itself. This has been Cipher Tales. Keep questioning, keep decoding, keep discovering the secrets that changed history.